All right, let's talk about a word that you've probably used, maybe even to describe yourself, perfectionist. But what are we really talking about when we use that word? We're going to dive deep into that question, and we'll use a fascinating psychological report to guide us. We all have this picture in our heads, right? Someone who's super organized, has really high standards, maybe they're a little obsessive about details. But what if I told you that from a psychologist's point of view, it's way more complex and honestly, a lot more serious than that? So here's the first big idea you've got to grab onto. Perfectionism isn't just one thing. It's not an on or off switch. The term psychologists use is multidimensional. So think of it less like a single personality quirk and more like a cocktail of different psychological drivers. And as we're about to see, each of those drivers comes with its own set of motivations and its own unique dangers.
Okay, so how do we even begin to untangle all this? Well, luckily, psychologists have this really powerful model that breaks perfectionism down into three distinct types, or as I like to think of them, three different faces. Getting to know these three is absolutely key to understanding how this all plays out in a person's life, which is exactly what we'll see in our case study.
First up, we have self-oriented perfectionism. This is the one you're probably most familiar with. It's that voice inside your head, the one that's always saying, I have to be perfect. It's all about setting these impossibly high standards for yourself and then, really beating yourself up when you inevitably fall short. Then you've got other-oriented perfectionism. And here, the whole script gets flipped. Now, that demand for perfection isn't aimed at yourself. It's turned outward, onto everyone around you. Your spouse, your kids, your colleagues. And, as you can probably guess, this can be a recipe for some serious drama and friction in your relationships. And the third phase is called socially prescribed perfectionism. And this one is particularly tough. It's not about what you demand of yourself or what you demand from other people. It's this constant gnawing feeling that everyone else expects you to be perfect. And that if you're not, your entire self-worth is on the line. It's a really tough spot to be in. So the theory's great, but let's make this real. Let's see how these ideas actually show up in a real person. We're going to open up a case file, basically, and look at an actual psychological report that brings these three types of perfectionism to life. So let's meet Sarah Smith. She's 25 years old, and she took a standardized psychological test called the Multidimensional Perfectionism Scale, or MPS for short. The results from this test give us a really detailed map of her own unique perfectionist tendencies.
Okay, so here it is. This is what the test showed. This chart lays out Sarah's scores for each of those three types of perfectionism we just talked about. These are called T-scores, which is really just a fancy way of comparing her results to the general population. The higher the score, the stronger the trait. And yeah, those bars might look kind of similar at first glance, but trust me, the devil is in the details here. All right, let's decode these scores. We're going to go beyond just the numbers on the page and really dig into what they tell us about Sarah's life, her behaviors, and some of the potential risks she might be facing, all based on the official way this test is interpreted. So her first score for self-oriented perfectionism is a 58. The report calls this moderate. So it's not off the charts, but it definitely suggests Sarah has those classic perfectionist traits, compulsively pushing herself to succeed and then being her own worst critic when she feels she's failed. Next up, her other-oriented score is 57, so just 1 point lower and also in that moderate range. This tells us she probably holds the people in her life to those same really high standards, which, as we talked about, can cause some major problems. The report even points out that this can sometimes show up as being authoritarian or overly dominant. But here's where things get really, really telling. Her score for socially prescribed perfectionism is a 63. That's classified as elevated, and it's the most significant part of her profile. This suggests Sarah is living with this crushing belief that her value as a person is completely conditional, that it all hangs on whether she can meet what she perceives as other people's expectations. In that headspace, every little mistake feels like a source of potential rejection and just deep, deep shame. Okay, so we've got the scores, but you might be asking, why does any of this actually matter? What's the so what? Well, the report lays out a whole list of psychological risks that are associated with high scores in each of these categories, and they can be pretty severe. So for high self-oriented perfectionism, that internal pressure can be absolutely brutal. It's linked to things you might expect, like anxiety and low self-esteem, but it's also connected to much more serious outcomes, like chronic depression and even suicidal ideation.
When that perfectionism is aimed at other people, the damage starts to show up in relationships. It can come out as a need to control or devalue the people around you, having narcissistic traits, always blaming other people for problems, and, not surprisingly, causing huge strain on your closest relationships.
And that brings us back to Sarah's highest score. High socially prescribed perfectionism is often seen as the most debilitating form of all. It's tied very strongly to a deep fear of making mistakes, constant feelings of shame and hopelessness, and a really high vulnerability to both anxiety and depression. And yes, the report explicitly lists suicidal thoughts as a risk here too.
And this quote from the report it sums it all up, doesn't it? When these dimensions are all high, your whole life becomes this high-stakes tightrope walk where any little misstep feels like a total catastrophe. It's a chaotic, incredibly stressful way to live, where your performance becomes your identity, and building deep, meaningful connections feels almost impossible.
But hang on, there's one more crucial piece of context we need here. The chart on the left, that's Sarah compared to the general population. But look at the chart on the right. That compares her to a clinical population. We're talking about people who are already in therapy seeking help. And this comparison is so important. It shows that while Sarah's scores are high for an average person, they're actually much closer to the norm for someone who is already getting psychological support. It's all about perspective.
So what is the big takeaway from all of this? I think it's that just calling someone a perfectionist and leaving it at that is a huge mistake. You have to ask, where is that pressure coming from? Is it from within? Is it being aimed at other people? Or, like in Sarah's case, is it this crippling belief that the entire world is demanding you be perfect? Knowing the source, knowing the type, that's the first step to really understanding the true impact it has on a person's life. Which brings us to one last, really important question. In a world that so often seems to scream for perfection, how do we start to untangle our self-worth from our performance? How do we find the courage to really truly believe that good enough is, in fact, more than enough?